1 minute ago, the trade war Donald Trump thought he could control slipped out of his hands, and it was Canada that snapped the final thread. You are watching a U.S. president who built his entire political brand on hardball deals get boxed in by a neighbor 1/10 America's size in front of global markets, allied capitals, and his own supporters. And the part nobody on cable news is spelling out clearly is this: when Washington's leverage collapses, the damage doesn't just hit politicians, it hits your job security, your retirement account, and the price you pay at the pump. So let's strip this down to what actually just happened, why Canada was able to break Trump's trade ultimatum without firing a shot, and how the fallout lands on you, not just on a few politicians yelling at each other on TV. Trump's ultimatum sounded simple and brutal: fall in line with Washington's China policy or face 100% tariffs on Canadian exports, 50% levies on aircraft, and threats to decertify planes built north of the border. On Truth Social and friendly networks, it played like a show of strength. But step away from the slogans and look at the actual moves Canada just made, and you see something very different. A middle power that has quietly spent 2 years rewiring its trade relationships, planning for this exact showdown, and waiting for Trump to overplay his hand. That overplay started in Davos. On January 20th, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in front of a room full of presidents, CEOs, and central bankers at the World Economic Forum and said one sentence that detonated in Washington: middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Trump was in the same Swiss resort, hearing that message secondhand in real time. Within 72 hours, Canada was disinvited from his so-called Board of Peace. Trump was threatening 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Ottawa dared sign a serious deal with Beijing, and he was publicly calling Carney governor instead of prime minister. A not-so-subtle way of implying Canada should remember who the superpower is. That was the ultimatum: stay in America's lane or get punished. If this story ended there, it would look like every other strong-arm tactic Trump used in his first term. But it didn't end there because Carney did something U.S. advisors didn't expect. He refused to play the supporting role in Trump's script. When Trump claimed Canada lives because of the United States, Carney didn't dodge. He looked into a camera and said clearly and calmly, "Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian." Then he did something even more dangerous to Trump's leverage. He told voters on both sides of the border that he considered the 100% tariff threat bluster, and he said he meant every word he'd spoken in Davos. That word, bluster, isn't just an insult. It's a signal to businesses, investors, and foreign governments that Ottawa sees Washington's threats as politically loud but operationally weak. The White House tried to claw that back. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Fox News that Carney had privately softened his Davos remarks in a phone call. Less than 24 hours later, Carney held a press conference and said on camera, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos." That's a foreign leader publicly contradicting the U.S. Treasury Secretary and, by extension, Trump himself, on a verifiable fact. When you can show the receipts, calling a superpower's bluff stops being risky posturing and starts becoming a viable strategy. But the reason Carney could afford to do that, and the reason Trump's ultimatum cracked, is not just rhetorical, it's structural. Let's talk about the part of this story that actually decides who has leverage: the numbers. Every year, roughly $400 billion in Canadian goods flow into the U.S., and hundreds of billions in American goods flow the other way. Canada isn't just a nice neighbor. It's the single largest export market for the United States, with dozens of U.S. states selling more to Canada than to any other country on Earth. When an American farmer sells wheat abroad, when a factory in Michigan ships auto parts, when a tech company in Washington state licenses software, the single foreign customer most likely to be on the other end of that transaction is Canadian. And then there's energy. Canada supplies the majority of crude oil the U.S. imports. Those are molecules flowing through pipelines and tankers into American refineries every day. If Trump actually tried to make good on a 100% tariff across that kind of volume, it wouldn't just be a message to Ottawa. It would be a grenade rolled under the U.S. consumer economy. Gasoline and diesel prices would spike in weeks, not months. The entire North American auto supply chain, which depends on Canadian aluminum, steel, and components, would seize up as costs exploded and just-in-time deliveries collapsed. The White House can try to brand that as America getting tough, but workers watching overtime disappear and car buyers staring at higher prices are not going to care about whose name is on the ultimatum. That is the first crack in Washington's leverage. Trump's favorite threat tool, tariffs, is pointed straight at people he needs to keep on his side. Carney knows that. Canadian trade officials know that. Multinational companies know that. The only people pretending the math works are those who benefit from the sound of the threat, not its outcome. Now layer on top of that the legal reality Trump boxed himself into. The US-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, the deal Trump once called the best trade agreement ever made, is the same agreement that now shields most Canadian goods from exactly the kind of blanket tariffs he's waving around as punishment. As of late 2025, the overwhelming majority of cross-border trade between Canada and the U.S. flows either tariff-free or under tightly constrained conditions defined by that agreement. To impose 100% tariffs across the board, Trump would not just be getting tough, he would be openly violating the signature trade deal that his own administration negotiated and sold as a victory. He tried to push that boundary once already. In early 2025, invoking emergency powers, he slapped steep tariffs on a wide basket of Canadian imports. Ottawa hit back with retaliatory levies on U.S. goods. American manufacturers started ringing alarm bells, and within months, the administration had to carve out broad exemptions for USMCA-compliant products because the economic collateral damage inside the U.S. was too severe. That episode quietly taught capital markets, supply chain managers, and foreign governments a simple lesson. Trump can threaten a lot, but when those threats collide with treaty law and domestic backlash, they don't last. Fast forward to his current ultimatum, and you can see why Carney was willing to stare him down. The second crack in Washington's leverage is legal and political. The tools Trump is brandishing are not as sharp as he claims, and everyone who needs to know that already does. Now add the move that really snapped the ultimatum, Canada's deal with China. Despite explicit warnings from Washington not to deepen ties with Beijing, Carney flew to China and signed a package that quietly rewired a chunk of Canadian trade away from U.S. dependence. Under that agreement, a controlled number of Chinese electric vehicles enter the Canadian market at manageable tariffs, while Beijing rolls back punishing duties on key Canadian agricultural exports, canola, seafood, pulses, that had been caught in the crossfire of earlier trade spats. To a casual viewer, that sounds like just another trade story. To anyone who understands leverage, it's a signal flare. Canada is diversifying its options. It isn't walking into China's arms. It's making sure it doesn't show up to a showdown with Washington empty-handed. Here's where Trump made the kind of mistake that kills leverage. When the China-Canada deal was first announced, he applauded it, telling reporters it was a good thing for Canada to sign deals where it could. Only after Carney's Davos speech, only after that middle powers line went viral, and after it became clear Ottawa was not going to be a junior partner in a U.S. containment strategy, did Trump reverse himself and rebrand the same deal he had praised as a red line. That sequence matters. Markets and ministries were watching. When a leader moves from good for him to you'll pay a price in 5 days without any fundamental change in the underlying facts, it tells everyone something uncomfortable. The threats are not anchored in a long-term strategy. They're anchored in personal offense. That is the third crack in Washington's leverage, predictability. Real power in trade doesn't just come from how big your economy is. It comes from other countries believing that when you draw a red line, it's thought through, connected to a plan, and likely to hold. When red lines move based on who offended whom at a forum in Switzerland, leverage erodes. Carney is exploiting that. In public, he talks about principles and middle powers. In private, his team is quietly signing or advancing negotiations with India, ASEAN economies, and South American partners. Those deals don't replace the U.S. market. They rebalance Canada's exposure so that when Trump slams his fist on the table, he's no longer dealing with a partner who has nowhere else to go. Middle powers acting together, exactly as Carney promised. Meanwhile, on the U.S. side, the administration is doubling down on the one remaining pressure point it thinks it fully controls: certification and tariffs on Canadian aircraft. Trump's latest volley, talk of decertifying Canadian-built planes and slapping 50% tariffs on new deliveries, is meant to sound like a surgical strike on a symbol of Canadian industry. Bombardier, after all, is a flagship brand. But scratch the surface and you see why this, too, backfires as leverage. Most of Bombardier's larger business jets already flying in U.S. airspace are certified by the Federal Aviation Administration. They're owned and operated by U.S. corporations and wealthy individuals. Retroactively pulling their certification would mean grounding American-owned aircraft overnight, snarling business travel, scrambling schedules for executives and charter operators, and enraging exactly the donor class Trump has spent years cultivating. Even officials within his orbit have had to quietly admit that no one is seriously planning to invalidate the certificates of jets already flying. That turns the decertification threat into something else. A signal to markets that the White House is willing to casually throw out words that, if taken literally, would disrupt its own economy. Trade lawyers call that a credibility problem. Investors call it policy risk. Voters call it chaos. Whatever label you use, it's corrosive to leverage. And this is where Carney's discipline stands out. While Trump escalates rhetoric, the Canadian line on aircraft has stayed the same. Certification is a technical safety issue, not a political weapon, and Ottawa expects regulators on both sides of the border to treat it that way. No name-calling, no all-caps posts, no ultimata, just a calm refusal to validate the idea that safety oversight can be bent to win a press cycle. That contrast lands with courts, agencies, and companies. When one side waves around tools it probably can't legally or practically use, and the other side refuses to even acknowledge those tools as legitimate bargaining chips, the threat drains of force. Now zoom out from each of these individual clashes, tariffs, China, aircraft, and look at the pattern. Trump's strategy rests on a simple formula: issue maximal threats, personalize the conflict, and assume that because the U.S. market is enormous, the other side will ultimately fold. That worked to a degree when confronting smaller, isolated economies with few options. It does not work when the target is a G7 country embedded in multiple trade networks, sitting on energy resources the U.S. relies on, and led by someone who has spent his career inside the architecture of global finance and regulation. Carney is not trying to win a symbolic shouting match. He's trying to methodically prove, case by case, that Trump's threats are bluff more often than they are binding. Every time Trump backs away from the edge, rolling back parts of earlier tariffs under pressure from American businesses, failing to follow through on promised 100% levies when Canada inked its China deal, letting Canadian aircraft continue flying despite talk of decertification, that proof gets stronger. Trade analysts have even started using a shorthand for the pattern, joking that Trump's approach is now the bluff and back-off doctrine. Talk big, draw an ultimatum, then quietly adjust when the legal and economic costs land on your own doorstep. Once that perception hardens in foreign capitals, something subtle but significant changes. Tariff threats stop being terrifying unknowns and start being just another input in a risk model. A finance ministry can say, yes, this tweet is loud, but last time we saw this movie, the third act ended with an exemption. That alone erodes leverage. And running under all of this is the clock almost nobody is talking about when they argue about one post or one press conference: the mandatory review of USMCA in July 2026. That review is hardwired into the deal. It is coming whether politicians are ready or not. Trump has already signaled that he wants to use that moment to tighten the screws on Canada's ability to do business with China, to clamp down on what he sees as loopholes, and to reassert Washington's primacy over North American trade rules. Carney is signaling something different, that Ottawa is prepared to walk into that review not as a supplicant trying to avoid punishment, but as a partner with new options already partially in place. That is what it means to break an ultimatum. When one side says, do this or suffer, and the target responds by calmly diversifying, holding firm in public, and forcing the issuer of the ultimatum to repeatedly step back from his own red lines, the psychological balance flips. Ultimatums derive their power from one belief, that the person issuing them is more willing to absorb pain than the person receiving them. Canada's strategy has been to quietly make itself more resilient to shocks, while making clear to U.S. voters, unions, and companies that the immediate economic explosion from all-out tariffs would go off on their side of the border, too. When the people Trump needs most, Midwestern manufacturers, energy consumers, cross-border logistics firms, start to see his trade weapons as pointed in both directions, leverage drains away. So here's where you come in. This isn't just a North American version of political chess for insiders. If you live in the US or Canada, and especially if you earn your living in manufacturing, transport, agriculture, or energy, your world is now tied to whether Trump keeps trying to rule by tariff threat or whether this collapse in leverage forces a different approach. Watch the signals. If you see more Canadian announcements about deals with India, ASEAN, or South American blocs in the next few months, that's not random diplomacy. That's Ottawa tightening the safety net for a post-ultimatum world. If you see U.S. business associations, farm groups, and chambers of commerce start to break publicly with the White House on 100% tariff talk, that's not disloyalty. That's survival instinct kicking in. And if you see gas prices start to climb while the rhetoric about punishing Canadian energy keeps escalating, ask yourself a simple question: who is actually paying for this trade war? Because the real collapse of Washington's leverage isn't a headline. It's the quiet moment when voters and businesses decide that they are done being the collateral damage in someone else's negotiating performance. Trump thought tariffs would make America untouchable. What Canada just showed is that, in a world of middle powers with options, overplaying the tariff card can make America predictable, bypassable, and eventually ignorable. If you want to stay ahead of how that plays out, where the next leverage cracks appear, which countries copy Canada's playbook, and what it means for your savings, your job, and your cost of living, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments, who do you think calls Trump's next bluff, and what happens when they do?